Hi, good morning. I am the chair of interior design here at Pratt Institute, architect and urban design degree from the University of Notre Dame, pre-classicism.
Excellent. Thanks, David.
Mm-hmm.
Frank Giswaldi. Frank, it's nice to see you.
Lawrence. Morning, everyone. I'm Frank Giswaldi, a practicing architect in New York, a friend of Pratt. I've taught this course and other courses at Pratt, and happy to be here and seeing the projects today.
Terrific. Thanks, Frank, for coming. Molly Hunker, please.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Molly Hunker. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Architecture at Syracuse University and co-captain of an office called Sports.
Nice. Okay, Jamaluddin.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Ziad Jamaluddin, a partner at Left Architects based in Beirut and New York, and a faculty at Columbia GSAP.
Thanks for coming. We have, let's see here. Is it Ciaran O'Brien?
Hi, thanks for having me. It's Ciaran O'Brien. It's a difficult Irish name. No worries at all. It's a difficult Old Irish name.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm a lecturer at the University of Westminster in London. I'm also at the Royal College of Art. I've got my own practice in London called Red Deer. We kind of focus on architecture, interior design, mostly situated in the UK and Europe. So it's great to be here. Looking forward to seeing the projects.
Thanks for coming, Ciaran.
Thanks.
And of course, Alex Schwitter.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Alex Schwitter. I practice between performance art and architecture. I've had this practice for over 2 decades, which is collected at the Museum of Modern Art. I'm a Pratt graduate and very happy to be here as well. Hello, everyone.
Thank you. How about Sophia?
Hi, good morning. My name is Sophia Gruzdies. I'm an architect and divide my time between Barcelona and New York. I'm in Barcelona right now, and I've had the privilege of having many of these students who will be presenting today in the Rome studio last year. So I'm delighted, absolutely delighted to see them and the projects and engage in the discussion. Thank you.
We're happy you're here. Did I miss anyone else? If I did, I apologize. Is there anyone else that I missed? Okay, well, we're going to be beginning. I'm Lawrence Blau. You'll all introduce myself. Hey,
Lawrence, maybe yes. You should just say I'm your sidekick.
Yes, ma'am. I'm going to do that. But we're not up yet. Maybe we'll get all the faculty to introduce themselves. I'm Lawrence Blau, and I'm going to get Debbie to introduce herself too. We're one of the faculty teams that are presenting today. I'm a full-time faculty member of the School of Architecture, and I teach a degree project and many other things in the school, including advanced studios, and I'm also the head of the core design sequence. Deborah?
Hi, so I've been teaching degree project with Lawrence this year. It's been a pleasure. I'm a faculty member in the School of Architecture, and I have a practice called Ganson Company in New York. Nice to see you all, my friends.
Yeah.
Eva?
Hello, good morning. I'm Eva Perez de Vega. I co-teach with Gonzalo, and I'm also a partner at E+I Studio based in Lower Manhattan.
Maybe Gonzalo should go next.
I'm the partner. Gonzalo Carvalho. I'm a professional. I have a professional practice here in Brooklyn too, called Sour Studio and Pratt faculty. Thank you for coming, everyone.
Tule?
Hi, I'm Tulay Atak. I teach degree project here at Pratt, and I also coordinate the 4th year Urban Genealogies course here. So I know all the students actually in different sections.
Thanks, Professor Wistop.
Hi, so I'm Tulay's partner in degree project. I also teach first year design studio off and on, and I have a small practice in Chinatown called Clouds Architecture Office.
Okay, so thanks so much, Ostap. So what we're going to be doing, reviewers, is that we have approximately, about 40 minutes, 45 minutes for each session. There's going to be 3 presentations in this group, and we're going to be starting out with Ostap and Tulay's group. I don't know if you want to introduce, David, maybe you'd like to introduce yourself too, because I know you're doing the HMS.
Yes, thanks, Lawrence. Hi, I'm David Kim, and I am the HMS writing partner for Tulay and Ostap, and I also teach first year studio here. And it's great to be here. Looking forward to it.
And while I'm thanks so much, David. And while I'm doing this, I don't know is Daniela here? Fabricius?
She can't make it this morning. She'll be in the afternoon.
Okay, great. And then I can't forget Paul. Paul, are you here?
Yeah, I'm Paul Haka. I've had the pleasure to work with Deborah and Lawrence this year on the degree project. I'm excited to see the other projects all day. I'm in the Humanities and Media Studies department. I work a lot with architecture writing as well as literature, film, critical theory, urban studies. Thanks. Good to see everyone.
Terrific. So I'll be, I'm going to pass it to Tulay and Ostap. You guys, you might want to do a quick little brief introduction about your brief and then introduce your students. And I hope they're ready to go. Thanks.
Lawrence, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm getting some questions from some of our guests about the mural board that group B is not there. I'm not sure if you could advise where they should go. That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I will copy the Miro board link out of the spreadsheet that Jason gave me. The students who are presenting might be sharing their own Miro board too. I don't know if your students are doing that or not, Tulay.
I'm putting that in the chat myself, but just.
Did you just include the link? You did. Thank you, Farzan.
Okay, so shall we start?
Yeah, let me, I should probably start recording this thing. Oh, you're recording it anyway, Farzan, right?
So we teach a section of the degree project seminar and studio called Architecture and the Atmosphere. We look at the question of the atmosphere and we approach it from 2 perspectives, 2 sides. One is as air, which we define as the collective, shared, communal, social, and atmosphere as the technical, scientific, also has to do with building systems. And we'll stop.
Yeah, so the atmosphere is a prompt, just a loose framework to get the students started in the fall. And invariably what we found over the several years that we've been doing this theme is that it pretty quickly brings out sort of disciplinary questions of interiority, exteriority, thermodynamic issues such as heat or humidity, radiation, convection, etc., as well as how the architecture sits on the ground and issues of grounding the buildings. Our goal is usually to end up with an architectural proposal, like actually a building. Even though we start with the air and the ephemeral, we try to end up with something concrete. So I think that's pretty much it. Tulay, I don't know if there's anything to add before we start.
We should introduce Chuyi and Danley, our students, who will be presenting the Inside Out Courthouse. Please take it away.
Okay. Hi, I'm Danley. Hi, I'm Chuyi. Is Danley sharing the screen for us? I'm sharing now. Okay. Okay. So our project is called Inside Our Courthouse, an exploration of distributed institutions. Our project reimagines the courthouse into the urban space by letting the courthouse take place in an urban setting and in the form of a distributed institute. By turning it inside out, we let public evaluate and redefine the meaning of justice and undermine the power of the administrative side of the courthouse. The US history is a history of immigration, as to some extent the nation is formed by immigrants. However, immigration has become a frequent topic of political debates throughout history, and there have been unjust federal policies targeting immigrants. We found two examples here, such as Trump's immigration crackdown, which has expanded the number of people considered a priority of deportation.
So the immigration judicial system of the US is often seems to be criminalizing the immigrants rather than providing consistent justice. And the current system of the immigration judicial system is has like two types of problems that doesn't really help with the justice. Do you want to go to the next page? So the first one is that the immigration hearings are typically held less formally and they usually don't have jury trials. And the second is that the immigration judge is classified as a government attorneys and thus leaves them vulnerable to political pressure and interference in case management. So in order to understand the spatial implications of this process, so we try to do a series of studies where we're taking the roles within the courtrooms, such as the public spectator, the jury, the judge, the clerk, the defendant, respondent, and placing them within this, positions them into the plans of various theaters from different cultures to see how the power dynamics and the roles will shift with this study. And what we found out is that sometimes the audience would gain more privilege in certain settings, while in other settings, the judge's power would be dissolved in this linear plans. So Stan Allen's concept of distributed institute is very important for us while in developing this project. So this desire of opening up the public institute and also making transparent the process, the justice process, I think it really speaks to our goal of elevating the visibility and transparency within the courtroom.
And based on those studies, we focus on how to open up the modern institutions such as the courthouse by making compositional breaks and increasing transparency to allow the public perceive what is taking place. The current courthouse with the centralized impermeable structure make law less accessible to laypersons. The power of public discourse could undermine the administrative aspect of the courtroom, and that could be happen in place such as in intermediary spaces, which we diagram here, between the courtroom and the offices. And the second aspect we analyze on is the enclosure. We first found this example of Plato's cave. Those prisoners would deem reality to be nothing else than the shadow of the artificial objects. Shadows are apprehended as reality. The relationship between the shadow and reality is established under the setting of the theatricality. The Plato's cave is a metaphor of reality, and what is perceived as truth or reality by public is actually the shadow of a puppet show. This is a diagram of the enclosure by trying to use this curved wall to solve the inside-out problem. When people are in a system that they take to be self-contained, how do we perceive as morality or justice can be distorted? We questioned is the enclosure of the courthouse protect the process of justice, or is it the opposite? To open up the courthouse is to claim the power of public. How can a courthouse therefore to transform into a theater of justice where law is performed and citizens can be engaged?
Do you want to go to the plans?
Yeah.
Yeah. So our site is situated at the PATH station at New Jersey. So the drawings to the left was the previous condition with showing the entrance of the underground pathways with a large parking lot in the center of the site. And our proposal is to having these walls as this mediator between the public and the inside of the courtroom, and bringing the public transportation into our buildings. So in order to increase the public engagement, we redesigned the circulation on the site so that it blends into the urban fabric, and the circulation would actually flows into the buildings from various directions. So in this drawing, you will see how cars are going into the buildings through the ramps, and there will be parking spaces provided, and as well as how the human circulation would work on the site.
You want to keep going?
Yeah. So the power of public is very important for us in terms of bringing public within the courtroom. So in the notes towards the performative theory of assembly, Judith Butler discussed the power of public gatherings and how the bodies can act politically. And so it is this is an important point because it is not the case that the body only establishes my own perspective. It is also that which displaces that perspective and makes that displacement into a necessity. So by displacing the bodies and the actions, the place gain the character of educating the public. By creating transparent walkways, the administrative and bureaucratic aspects of the court can be made visible to the public. So another aspect of the project that we looked into is the power of shadows as a way to enhance the visibility of the judicial system. So in this quote, we're looking at the body to understand ourselves as a sign among other signs. So the law system is, we looked at the stage sets designed by Moholy Nagy, where actually the shadows gains equal importance as a physical physical settings, and they both becomes a way to carry meanings, and which I think works similarly into our bodies within the courtrooms. So the steinography and the court sketches are really just traditionally coded way to communicate activities within the courtroom. So in this project, we also tested the shadow's ability to conceal identities when it's necessary, but also they would be able to provide new means of engagement in the recordings for the public.
And these are some of the lighting studies we make the physical model. The light source also creates a boundary around the people who work close to light source by a blindness effect. This way it protects the defendant and their family from being seen, and the shadow on the wall can be delivered as an image to the public. By hybrid the immigration courthouse with other components that open to public, such as the lecture hall, library, and non-profit organizations that help immigrants. The project also achieved a goal of educating the public. The intermediary spaces between the courtroom and the office became the spaces for public discourse. In this rendering, it shows the car ramp going underneath, and here is the spaces outside an auditorium where people is walking by, and here is the people observers shadow being projected on the wall and can be seen by the people inside the courtroom. And this is a simple diagram showing the spatial and sectional relationship and the layerings in our inside of courtroom. The shadow of the public observers are projected onto the wall and could be perceived by the judge and the government attorney. The shadow of both people and administration and the public observers became a perform of their presence. With the intensity and size being controlled under different lighting conditions, shadow can be blurred or amplified. The shadow play evokes their awareness and the subjectivity. This is the rendering that people walk outside the courtroom before they enter into the courtroom. The shadow being projected onto the wall. The government attorney's shadow can be projected so that the public that is dominating this courthouse can all see their shadows. And the last slide is some other views that showing this is outside one of the courtroom, and this is in the ramp, in a car ramp where you can see the curved wall with the shadow that delivers the images inside the courtroom. This is another space for
the other players in the leisure space.
In the courtroom. Thank you. That's it. And just want to show some of the plan and sections.
Lawrence, are we open to start asking questions now?
Please do.
Okay, so could you explain a little bit further whose shadow is watching whose and the shadows in general? I'm a little bit confused about who is seeing a shadow, because I think that it remained a little unclear for me.
So it's both the public's shadow will be projected on the wall to let the government attorney and the people inside the courtroom could see the shadow as a representative of the power of public, and also sometimes in the views, the shadow of the government person is projected on the shadow as way of deliver the images of what is happening in the courtroom.
So you've touched on a really important subject. You've touched on actually something that is still quite current. There's, do you know the New Sanctuary Coalition in New York City? They operate out of the Judson Church. Did you engage groups that are advocating on behalf of immigrants? New Sanctuary Coalition. So it's a group that organizes volunteer activities where members of the public can go and accompany someone who doesn't have a lawyer at their hearing, right? And I saw you referred to Judith Butler's performative theory of assembly as referring to the joining of bodies together as an act of speech, as an act of resistance. And I'm a little bit, that this is already happening where people can go into the federal courthouse and accompany a person. And so I'm a little bit wondering about what the difference is with using a shadow as a proxy. The shadow kind of removes specificity from a body and kind of removes, it's almost like you were to, if you're thinking about an assembly as a speech act, it's almost as though you are sort of blurring the voice of the person. You're obscuring the voice, you're changing the voice of the public in that shadowed presence. People can already go and be present at a hearing in support of a person who has no legal representation, just as a kind of like show of support. So I'm wondering how your project in the use of shadows is going beyond what's already available.
I think what you have mentioned about the sanctuary program is about kind of the specificity between two people and their relationships. But what we're trying to do here is actually to enhance the visibility of the process to the general public, and also how that could actually create a potentially new type of public space. But also the shadow also acts as this means of almost like a new means of recording, like the court sketches and the stenographies, that I think it cannot be achieved by like just simply being accompanied. So it's also a means of recording and also a means of like enhanced visibility.
Well, I'm suspicious of the use of shadows to do that, but I don't want to take up all the time here, so I'll end my comments there.
Yeah, if I may jump in here.
First of all, I really appreciate very much both of you taking on this subject. It's a very, very important subject, very critical, very timely, and so on, and really puts us architects and architecture itself on the line in the sense to what extent should or to what role can a dynamic or prototypical, if you will, work of architecture, in fact, and allow me to use the word humanize, okay, this entire process. Because if I understand you correctly, this courthouse or this building type is really primarily for people facing deportation and all the rest of it. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So therefore, it's a very, very, in other words, you cannot put into a space that is used rightly or wrongly to judge criminals, okay, or to people that have done terrible things, with a family, okay, that simply wants to somehow have a better future, to save themselves from violence and whatever background they're coming from. So therefore, I think that to the degree that it can, an act of architecture must humanize and not intimidate those people that it is meant to serve, okay? For instance, did you ever consider decentralizing this function, which is a very sort of traditional thing, create the equivalent through a work of architecture, okay, of a town square, of a traditional coffee shop, of a traditional meeting place, of a religious space, and so on and so forth, okay, where the community that they can, or the community or their neighbors or others like them can come together, along with those that are meant to somehow be judged or whatever, you know, by this process relating to their immigration, along with those that are in authority. That becomes potentially a very interesting architectural program. You have three components. You have the extended family, perhaps, or the public, but the public that is in a similar situation that would empathize with what's going on. You have the authorities, or those that are, you know, about to make decisions, and then of course you have those families or individuals that, you know, want somehow to be saved, if you will, okay, and so on. So I just wish that more of that was somehow examined by you as at least a possibility. Maybe what you proposed is what makes most sense, but I would have liked to have seen really other possibilities of the democratization and the decentralization of this particular program or particular function. And architecture has enormous power, you know, we have to believe in that, to make us feel different things. Very briefly, many years ago, I visited Chandigarh. And I was taken around by, of all people, the chief of police. I don't know why. I was there sort of on the part of Pratt. But anyway, and so we went, of course, it happened to be a Sunday, and we went to the courthouse, the famous Corbusier's famous courthouse at Chandigarh. And, you know, I looked around and I asked the chief of police, I said, what do you think, you know, how do people feel about this building? And he hemmed and hawed. He was a very polite Indian gentleman. And he said, you know, I said, no, tell me, what do people feel? And he said, well, Professor David, I know that everyone loves this building. You learned about it in school and so on and so forth. But as you know, he says, people come here with problems. And the architecture intimidates them. So he was very critical of the architecture, something that we think is fabulous and we learn about in school. But he said, people that come here, they come here with problems and the architecture intimidates them. So I throw that out there also. And I wish that that would have been taken into account in terms of the architectural language that you yourself would finally realize here. And I'll leave my comments for now at that. Thank you.
Chuyi and Danley, thank you so much for your presentation and for your work. I think it's a really beautiful project. Given what Tulay and Ostap were talking about relative to the overall starting place of the studio or of the projects being about air, it seems clear to me that this is ultimately an exploration of the sort of immaterial or intangible effects of architecture and program in this specific program. So right now you're exploring that primarily through this sort of shadow play and projection. It certainly participates in a long history within architecture of working with different kind of lighting effects and shadows. And I wonder, to kind of bring that idea even further and sort of beyond this particular program, or even sort of emphasizing particular qualities of that, you could explore similar conditions with specific kind of tectonic language that allows for a kind of proliferation of shadows in particular areas. You're already doing it through surface material of transparency, translucency, and opacity, which I think is really great and successful. I also wonder about the other qualities of architecture that you could sort of reveal, right? Because you're ultimately here interested in revealing something that we don't often get to see. And so architecture can do that in a number of ways by externalizing, you're talking about the inside out courthouse. I'm wondering about what else can be turned inside out. Are we seeing the sort of infrastructure, plumbing, HVAC, et cetera, things that we wouldn't normally see, the guts of architecture, and there's certainly precedence for that. But there's a number of different qualities here that go beyond just the shadows of the people. And thinking about the shadows of other aspects, the revealing of things that are typically hidden, even the sort of flipping of material expectations like hardness versus softness. Like a lot of courthouse spaces have, their maybe typical interior spaces where there starts to be way more soft materials and things. Does that start to also get flipped? So I think there's a lot of layers within your kind of initial setup that could be explored further to further investigate the sort of both the immaterial or intangible, but also this idea of revealing hidden systems or flipping the inside out. So I think there's a lot of potential there. And to me, this is kind of just the beginning of that, which is actually a great place to be for a degree project, because it sort of opens up territory to continue working in for many years to come. So I would just like for you guys to sort of think about how this really beautiful idea, and I think initial kind of beautiful study through this project actually could be sort of proliferated through many other systems that are inherent to architecture itself. And those again could play out through hopefully a number of projects that you both go on to do.
Can I just follow on to that? I thought what was really interesting in that sense, if we're talking about shadow, I'm going to give a completely different reading, because if we think about In Praise of Shadow, we're talking about the contrast between the East and the West, and the idea of light and clarity and shadow and subtlety. And so I thought this was very interesting. I took it much more as a polemic, meaning that it seems that the West is talking about, yes, clarity, and we're going to do everything the right way, while, the students to me are kind of saying, well, no, maybe there is a kind of subtlety. And again, to what Molly was saying about this idea of revealing certain parts, I thought it was very interesting, exactly this part of the shadow, of the subtlety of what is the real and what is reality and what isn't. So I thought that this was a very interesting take that I would like to see and explore even more, because I think that based on what everybody else has said, I find it very interesting, but I would like to add a different layer. As you can see, each person is seeing something different into it. And for me, this whole idea of the praise of shadow is something that I would explore even more. And in contrast, maybe to the system, to this idea of immigrants, how is that really faced in the United States? How is it, how, different administrations have looked at it, so I would even go even further into that.
Yeah, it's interesting. shadow, obviously the allegory of the cave, Plato's allegory of the cave. And in this instance, I think we have a degree project that's theoretically very rich. And I think that the hope is to bring that rich theory into the architecture itself, which has always been an issue in architecture. As I understand the project, and I think it's brilliant, right? Is that it's enunciating terms that are in the courthouse all along, which have to do with relationships of power and the kind of momentary nature that courthouse is sort of passed through, as opposed to there being a kind of stasis. And given that, there is a desire to upset the paradigm of a supposed theatricality of, spectatorship in the courtroom with the more, I would say, honest theatricality, if we want to take it that far, of Plato's cave, right? The more sort of trapped theatricality of that. And I think that's a wonderful prompt. And in many ways, I think that it's more conceptual than what some of the other jurors might have been thinking about, like just kind of social spaces, the way in which conceptual spaces are also powerful in themselves. And so this is a conceptual space, and then I'll go ahead and just, keep running with it. If this is a conceptual space, I'm wondering about the status of the wall in it. Insofar as it's this toroid, you have this continuous wall that wraps around it. And insofar as it's a continuous experiment of kind of being going around and around, a little bit trapped in the system, even if that system is somewhat dispersed. But then if you go, I'm sorry, can you move to one of the renderings, interior renderings? Yeah. I wonder about the punctured window in this case. I think that the condition that is probably more apt is the scrim, and I think the scrim can go from floor to ceiling. I think the scrim can be as continuous. I don't know that it needs to have right now. What Molly is talking about, the interiority of it is, and the tectonics of that is spot on. And right now, I think what's happening is that there's a replication of the room now just in the torus, right? And so the room is sort of marching around the torus, and it's replicating the room. And so this becomes kind of an enfilade more than it becomes a kind of continuous theater experience, like say the Guggenheim, in a kind of extreme, an extreme case. And I think in this, you could make it more of a continuous theatrical experience, and a little less like rooms without walls, right? Does that make sense? And take advantage of some of the linguistic conditions of the wall in the same way that in the allegory of the cave, the wall of the cave becomes the continuous experience of the shadows. Like that's one of the reasons why that reality is so convincing, is because it's not like in a screen, it's not framed, it's continuous to the wall. And so I think that you could take advantage of that architecturally into this interior. And then actually in that exterior, I wonder if there isn't a different theatrical experience that's happening in that exterior. We're not giving a lot of clues on this. We just see these exterior masses. I don't know if they're fortress-like. I don't know if they're the world of tomorrow, the 1939, Futurama world of tomorrow, and just kind of super enclosed in a shell. They look a little little bit like ding dongs, you know, like something, a pastry of some sort. But I think that then, that this is just as cinematic around it. And I think that there's an opportunity to also play on the air there so that it's less authoritarian and it's kind of massing, or maybe breaking that down a little bit and giving us some hints, some clues, some weirdnesses. And the same true as to where it hits the ground, the ramp that comes around. That ramp should be like kind of like the Futurama, like this moment of sort of confusion. For whom does this serve, right? For is this a vehicular administration? Is this an administration of mobile peoples? Is this an administration of fairness and justice? Which it probably isn't. It's a beautiful project.
Thank you.
Well, if I may compliment, sorry, if I very briefly what my colleagues, hopefully compliment what my colleagues have said. Once again, first of all, I worry about it being theater or theatrical. I mean, these people have problems. I'm not so sure that we really want to put them into that kind of a setting. But also looking, as was referred to by one of my colleagues, just, looking back historically, a courthouse, or as we know them, is like hospitals, believe it or not, is a relatively new building type. And these kinds of sort of decisions, if you will, about fellow citizens or about outsiders, whatever, were taken within the public space. In the Greeks did it in the agora, okay? And so on. Later on, it was done in religious spaces, in the great cathedrals or temples and what have you. So sometimes around the kitchen table, so to speak, okay, metaphorically, in the public plaza or piazza of traditional towns and villages and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying that you do not create a new building type, but I think your competition, if you will, is the, how shall I say, the more open, more democratic, more humane, if you will, environment where people's futures were decided. And I think that should not be forgotten as you develop, as you have every right to do, a new kind of building type or new kind of environment, built environment that in fact can perform this particular function.
Excuse me. I agree with many of the comments that's been put out, and I'm not going to repeat some of them, but maybe I can add something slightly different to the conversation. Is that I feel like your project is actually anti-theatrical in a way, because it kind of accepts the shadow. For me is a move towards opacity as opposed to transparency. And that might be something actually positive to explore or to, let's say, to debate. And I think we're having a very interesting conversation here. We often talk about sunshine laws and kind of transparency and the democratic process. And we know that this is not working for these immigrants who actually live in the shadow, and in a way invisibility is an asset, right? It's something that they seek. And transparency often comes at their detriment, right? I mean, ICE hangs out usually outside the courthouse to be able to see those people who are considered to be quote unquote illegal. So in that sense, I feel like your project could perhaps, I like the project a lot. I think your description of it maybe goes slightly in the opposite direction of what it's trying to produce, which is actually opacity here could be something that you can argue for. Of course, I'm not talking about opacity in the judicial system, but opacity in the spatial experience, right? So in a way, you're bringing the audience into the invisible spaces, so to speak, of the immigrant who often seek that kind of environment that's much more intimate. It's not the agora, it's not the plaza, it's not what they kind of exposed to the world, but it's almost bringing us into their world, right? So, and there is that experience of darkness and being behind the scene. And in that sense, I agree that the punch window and the room configuration start to become a little bit contradictory. And the spatial gradation of opacity, even more opacity, maybe to finally revealing, you know, if that person is at the end of the day given the right to be here, right, and not deported, could be one way of kind of outing right, of celebration, as opposed to just putting them out there to be gazed at, right, or looked at. I mean, besides that, I think really the prompt is very exciting. I really appreciate the fact that you took it on. It's a very complicated topic. Of course, as been mentioned just now, it's not only an architectural question, it's much more complicated than that. We probably have the privilege of kind of, or maybe not the privilege of, more often than not, kind of supporting the power, right, and system, as opposed to undermining it in the way architectural discipline is structured or practice. And I think here you're starting to challenge a little bit that boundary.
Yeah.
I'd just like to thank you both as well. It was a very beautiful presentation with lots of kind of life to it. I guess my perspective, unexpectedly, is that I've got some firsthand experience in this. My wife grew up undocumented in Los Angeles for 15 years. So yeah, strangely, everything you were saying was overlaid with the conversations around our kitchen table throughout the time we've known each other. And one of the great analogies she had for the process was it being equivalent to being stuck in traffic. So the immediate kind of shape of your form wasn't lost on me. It looks kind of like an intersection between one motorway or a flyover, whatever you guys call it, freeways, that's it. Junctioning between one area to another. So that was quite interesting for me. I rarely reference my wife in these areas, but yeah, but to me, it looks kind of like initially that you're trying to make the legal procedure that everyone goes through almost like navigating a landscape, which is quite interesting. And perhaps I was overlaying my own reading on it, but there were areas that looked like waypoints or landmarks that you'd pass, often like you'd pass kind of check marks in a legal process. Yeah, and some of the other comments from other kind of reviewers, the idea of shadow, sometimes you seek it and you try to evade being noticed, and other times it's more just how unclear the entire process is. Definitely the concept of humanizing overall was something that was lost in the process. And I think for us, the enjoyment of some of the project is in the cuts, because we understand it because of the clarity they offer us. But to stand in the space would be, in my opinion, quite oppressive. So I just wondered, was that intentional, or was that something that you thought could be kind of developed further? Yeah, it's particularly this kind of section with the car coming up and the guy standing on the ramp. Quite oppressive to kind of be in the car parking scenario. And I wondered if you were playing into this feeling of uneasiness, or intentionally to amplify that experience, but therefore it's just for the viewer rather than to aid the process of or soften that experience. So it would just be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that if you wanted to talk on it for a moment.
I think the kind of the paradox of like just whether we want public inside the space or not has been just like always a question for us. Because on one hand, I think we really want like the courtroom to become this kind of almost like a more visible and transparent space where like everybody would be able to kind of access it more easily, and that people would be able to kind of like hopefully understand each other better in this space, you know, whether it's like the driver who like casually comes in but they learn something new, or like the other people like they come in to kind of pursue their cases, and then like they would kind of have the sense of not being alone. But also we're also has been concerned about like whether this space actually was privileging the spectator rather than the actual participants. I think that's something we're trying to balance. But I think it's also something that maybe could be developed further if we were to.
I think it kind of comes back to the point of this unraveling, that the coiling of the building is perhaps not the right measure against which to base the time it takes often to get through this process. It takes years, decades. So you don't do this in a terrible afternoon at the DMV. It takes, yeah, it's like passing landmarks in a park. with a serious amount of time between some steps. Sometimes it's swift and light, and you feel like you're making progress, and other times it's dense and oppressive. But sometimes when you're in the dense and oppressive parts of the process, you need the opposite to feel levity. You need a puncture of light. Or when it's swift and light, you can deal with massing either side of you. So it's a bit of a paradox in what you require. My personal kind of idea would be to focus on the person standing there and less the spectator. And inherently, if that humanity is captured, then it will be a greater project as a spectator too, because you understand it's a better place to go through this process. But yeah, thank you again.
Thank you.
You know, I really liked your, thank you so much, Mr. O'Brien. I'm not going to attempt your Irish name, so please, the fault is mine.
No, it's fine. Kieran.
Kieran, thank you, Kieran. I think that I really love the way you brought your lived experience into the project, and I think that would really benefit this project, is kind of getting a closer understanding of what the lived experience of navigating the immigration system in this country would be. So by talking to people who are going through that process, you know, I'm looking throughout your figures, the way that you've represented bodies throughout your project in this image, in the shadows, and they're all shadows, even the ones with their in the courtroom sketch that you've drawn, or those right there, they all have their backs to us. There are no faces. And I feel like that's a bit kind of to the degree to which you have come to know the people for whom you're advocating. And just going back to Butler's writing that you reference, you know, the de-specification of bodies assists in the implementation of cruelty upon them. And I think that while your project is really kind of wanting to support people, it's doing the opposite, I'm sorry to say, because it's, you know, like there's not an understanding of what it specifically means. I mean, if I were in this building and I was having a major life decision sort of decided for me, I wouldn't want to see shadows all around me. I wouldn't know if they were for or against me. I would want to know that the specific people who are there to support me, I could see their faces. So I think the next step would really be to get to know people who are living this experience and see what would help them. And perhaps rather than sort of taking on the ineffable prompt that you were given, the prompt of ineffability that you kind of translated into shadows, I would like to see some attention paid to the laws and the legal structures that perhaps shape both architecture and our subjectivity, our role as civic subjects. So I think that there are some ways that this project could really take some steps forward by getting to know the people who are living the experience that you're designing around.
There's lots of ways that architecture has the power to dismantle. And I don't know, I mean, and this is just an engagement of this conversation. I don't know that it always has to be at the level of the personal. Can you go back, please, to the rendering? Sorry, yeah, with the car there. Incredible word here, which is undermine the administrative and bureaucratic aspects of the courtroom. And undermine is different from overthrow or redesign. Undermine seems to indicate a more almost, I know that I wouldn't say this about this building, but an almost subtle strategy, and I wouldn't say that about this building, wherein one can never go back to a regular courtroom again. And I think that insofar as the allegory of the cave is alive in this project and is quite instrumental in this project, or literally instrumentalized, literally inscribed, then it makes it such that the courtroom of the backs turned is impossible. Now, does it solve the problem of the courtroom, or does it solve the criminalization of the immigrant, which, you know, is, as Kieran is pointing out, you know, pervasive? No, probably not. But does it start to undermine and dismantle an idea about where justice is performed and how justice is performed and its theatricality that is already there? You know, we're having a little conversation about the emperor's new clothes, and you know, and in many ways this project is a kind of emperor's new clothes project. But I would say that it's not that the emperor's naked, but that the emperor's just full of clothing, like lots and lots of clothing. And one way to get at that is say, hey, got a lot of clothing on, and using that clothing as a vestige of absolute authority and power, even in systems like immigration, where it's not needed. It could be as benign as going to the DMV. It really could be. But there's so much, you know, like big walls and, you know, and barbed wire and such around immigration, and so much, you know, kind of steeliness of the ice, you know, resolve, if you will, that I love that it is pointing out the emperor's clothes.
Thanks, Dora. I think that unless there's any more other comments, I think that's a good one to end on.
I just want to thank both the students and the critics. This really was an amazing conversation. Thank you to the critics. And
Thank you.
I mean, like every time we discuss this project with different groups of people, it was this ambiguity that we landed on. And I actually, to Yi and Donnelly, applaud you for that ambiguity, because it's an intentional. Like, it is very much where you land, where you wanted us to take, and where I believe the conversation you wanted us to have. And I also applaud you for having the courage to develop a more theoretical project than an architectural project. Thank you.
Thank you
Yes,
very
I
much.
also
Thank you very much.
I would like to echo those comments. I also really appreciate the ambiguity in the project and the ambition of the project, especially this year, as your degree project year spanned the transition in administrations, and hopefully the shifting winds of policies behind the immigration. I would just say that also, maybe as like a learning point, like recognize what the precedents will get you and how far they'll get you, and knowing when to let go of them, so that the shadows like Plato and the White U House get you to a certain point, but you can also let go and break through that point to move beyond it. So just as a little footnote, but amazing project. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Great presentation.
Well done.
So I think we're gonna move next to Eva and Gonzalo. You guys want to do a little intro?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Go ahead,
So
Gonzalo.
thank you in advance for the comments you're going to give us. So we don't want to take too much time, but basically the name of our section is Human Cartographies. And our writing instructor, who is not here, is Daniela Fabricius, who has been really great help. And basically the aim of our section is to reimagine the future of architecture as living environments. And we really encourage the students to question and reinterpret the stale definition of what it means to be a human, and how to create a relationship with nature and technology in the framework of our current ecological crisis. It is a highly speculative section, and yet we require a lot of definition when it comes to designing the architecture for it. So hopefully that's what you will see. It's a student driven project where we actually guide them with a lot of assignments on a weekly basis.
Yeah, so just to add briefly to that, we were heavily influenced by the text called Camille Stories by Donna Haraway. which is actually collaborative text, but basically it takes us through 5 generations of Camille's and sort of different speculative scenarios, suggesting ways in which we might emerge from the other side of the climate catastrophe, kind of enmeshed as a species. So the project you'll see really takes on the multi-species approach to architecture and trying to really decentralize the human. So we framed it around 4 tomorrows. So you will actually see the project framed through 4 scenarios in time, where students envision different generations for the project and ways in which the architecture can kind of cut across, speculate on, and rethink the climate crisis. So with that, we'll leave you with Lara and Giza and their project called Reversion. And thank you so much for coming. We're thrilled to hear your comments.
Hello everyone, good morning. My name is Giza.
And I'm Lara.
We are presenting to you the reversion. We would like to start by asking you a simple question. Is it possible for us to settle underground? And what if we decided to go super deep instead of super tall? Reversion is a hypogeneous settlement that will activate the underground in response to the climate issues caused by harsh commercial farming and land use, proposing an underground space that will produce and supply farm goods to the cities.
We as humans have been dominating the surface of the earth for centuries through agriculture practices. As of today, by 2050, the world's population will reach 9.7 billion. 1 million people will be refugees of soil desertification. And by 2100, the weather on the planet will be 4 degrees warmer. According to the UN, the world's remaining topsoil will be gone in 60 years. This is what we think will happen in the next 400 years. For phase 1, in the next 100 years, there will be panic regarding climate change, and it will be the topmost priority for all countries. A lot of activism and awareness is spreading around the globe. It's too late when we realize that our planet has been hurt deeply, and global agreements are not enough to heal its wounds. But we are still trying to find solutions to improve our situation by driving electric cars, using recyclable materials, eating plant-based food, and the list goes on.
In phase 2, we are overtaken by the natural catastrophe. The overall planet is now 6 degrees warmer and has affected all kinds of living beings. Droughts have increased, the soil has lost its fertility, crop production is reduced, and starvation is now a global issue. Almost 1/3 of the global species are now extinct. There are environmental terror and suffering everywhere. All our planet's local and global ecological cycles are burned out, and the environment is beyond restoration. Feels as if the battle started by our ancestors in the 2000s is lost.
In the third phase, the application of the reversion is showing results. The soil is reviving and starting to contain moisture, and the microbes are flourishing within it. The birds and animals are starting to establish their place back into the nature. There is hope seen within the collective efforts of human and nature. We can sense the rise of unity among all living creatures as harmonious ecological cycles are established.
In the fourth and the final stage, the temperature of the Earth has stopped rising annually, and we have established a stable climate cycle. The new architecture is now focused within nature to promote ecological living. Now we reverse our expansion back to the ground, this time in a naturally conservative and environmentally equal relationship. Unity brought back all the life together and saved the extinction of a living planet. Now introducing to you the reversion proposal.
We have developed architectural responses to these 4 scenarios called hypogenes, which means growth of life underground. The growth of the structure and community takes inspiration from our ancestors. We settle where we form. The gateway to inhabit the underground starts with the interactions with New York City subway system, and then grows around them over time. Reversion's first phase will start with occupying abandoned underground subway platforms, and then will convert them into underground farms and composting centers.
100 years from now, the structure will grow over the years, accommodating more programs like leisure and living spaces, as well as shelter and refuge from harsh climate. 200 years from now, the structure will grow to a large scale and thus spatially expand to increase production and accommodation, turning into a settlement. 300 years from now, the structure has evolved up to the point where it is now an essential powerhouse of the city that grows food, recycles material, and refreshes the air.
But the underground is always seen as undesirable. Present day, we perceive the underground as dark, scary, evil, and dull. We usually associate it as undesirable because our ideas shaped by mythology, religion, and culture. As a result, today, graveyards, basements, and parking lots are not seen as desirable flourishing places by people. However, that was not always the case.
The underground has been used by ancestors for centuries. This timeline is a historical representation of the typology of cave and submerged habitat over thousands of years and their relevance in today's world. It is clear that man has been using underground as a shelter for years to be protected from enemies and harsh climatic conditions. We can predict that if the underground is explored as the future of settlements carrying forward this relationship, then there will be an improvement in the quality of nature above ground.
Underground can be beautiful cities created by man, as well as fascinating earth anomalies created by nature. For example, Cappadocia Underground City in Turkey and Krebera Cave in Georgia. Cappadocia Underground City inhabited multiple generations of people. The deep Krebera caves were home to multiple extreme environment organisms. Analysis of these caves helped us understand the relationship between history, geology, and scale over the passage of time.
To understand the relationship of living creatures and underground structure that exist in nature, we studied and analyzed the leafcutter ants' life cycle and complex burrow systems, along with their fungi farms and construction techniques. There is a hierarchy in nature about symbiotic relationship between living organisms that keeps these cycles sustained. The builder ant's body motion translated into our form finding process. The different types of motion generated different design conditions. The building anchors to the soil and subway station. Grass creates connectivity within spaces. Compression works with the outer skin, and transportation suggests vertical connectivity and passageway towards the ground.
New York City is known for its dense above and underground infrastructure, but we only are able to see all what stands above the ground. The layers beneath New York City are extremely rich with history, from exterior layer of asphalt with gas and electric lines which connect the whole city. Out of them all, most iconic underground structure is the subway system. These subway systems are a gateway into the underground growth of the reversion. The idea is to potentially upgrade all the abandoned subway platforms across Manhattan and use them with the same logic of expanding underground farms, because the subways connect the entire New York City metro area and also follows a decentralized system of connectivity.
Marked here is a map of the potential growth of these underground farms across New York City. Not only these platforms will be converted into vertical farm, but they also will be the existing train will act as cargo to supply the fresh produce across New York City. The first phase will start at the inner loop of South Ferry Station, located next to Battery Park. The station has 2 abandoned platforms that will be incorporated into the first stages of construction. The process of revival starts at the very tip of Manhattan.
We applied our research based on cave typologies and end studies to plan a decentralized underground system of chambers and tunnels, because insect societies are a marquee example of a complex decentralized system. A decentralized system breaks away from the hierarchy and inequality pattern and is highly efficient in terms of productivity. Where all its components are independent, the programs are organized based on 3 independent axes. These deep submerged spaces will be fueled by conventional services, use of natural ventilation through the chimneys, effect, and geothermal to maintain indoor temperatures, along with use of optical fibers and mirrors to bring daylight and create connection with the above ground and maintain a nasty relationship with it. Our form and shape was inspired by the studies with different materials like concrete and mag, and experimenting natural form making techniques. These processes helped us examine the dense and porous nature of space that needs to combine in our design in order to cherish the context as well as create living comfort.
Further analyzing the wax model helps us imagine the complexity of structure that can be created in nature, representing the idea of organic taking over inorganic. The porous nature of the hardened wax is suggestive of adding porosity to the soil, to the solid nature of the land. The sponge-like layer is the in-between condition of the hollow and the solid that will be coexisting underground. All the above research inspired us to develop a deep, complex web of tunnels and chambers that activate the underground and are a refuge space for all life. A farm is the essential vertical element which connects the deepest parts of the building to the exterior space. These farms are projected to be the engines that produce greens and oxygen. The tip of the farm is a chimney that exerts oxygen as a byproduct into the air. This exhaust is covered by community hills and gardens. Hydroponic, aeroponic, and fish farming are commonly used techniques in these chambers. The large vertical stacks are embedded within these chambers that also provide a sense of exterior greenery deep underground. The between pockets of open space provide a break from the intensity of the indoor environment.
The composting chambers are a facility that repurposes all waste in products used for farming and has the potential to recycle other waste to create building material. Research labs are a part of the space for innovation and advancements towards zero waste. The food is collected and moved into the pit by elevator. While the food scraps are in the pit, organic matter would produce air that is collected by condensers, and by a biofilter, it would return to the organic matter. This compost is directly consumed by the in-house farms and is a key element required for the farms.
Living and leisure here is a unique experience compared to the usual. The deep enclosure and the close relationship with history and nature. This may be an era where humans learn to rely on other senses beyond sight. However, to feel connected with the exterior world, all living, working in common spaces that carry an essence of the greenery that is found above ground, as well as maintain the quality of the surrounding depth. The building dissipates and interacts with the surrounding strata of the earth, as well as blending in with its context. The voids are refuge spaces for all forms of life and are a part of the exoskeleton of the space. The overall section is a representation of the building as a whole and represents depth and complexity of interlocked spaces. It can be seen the reversion of an urban city is happening. This time we are digging in instead of building up. All essential programs interlink with one another to create complex, self-sufficient farming chambers. The living experience here is redefining lifestyles by breaking away social assumptions about the underground. Essential elements make living here possible because of the primitive aspect of architecture that will be used in the design.
Large-scale deep vertical farms are the heart of this project. These are the power supplies of the green all across New York City. This is a locally sourced, sustainable, and environmentally friendly option for the future of farming. The spaces underground will be a unique combination of Cappadocia and Cribera caves. The functional pockets of spaces within the chambers meet the large open void.
A quote by Will Hunt: psychologically speaking, there is no environment so intolerable as a tight, dark underground enclosure where oxygen is scarce. And yet, throughout history, in every corner of the world, we have burrowed. In time of war or conflict, when we are at our most desperate, we have dug down into the dark and enclosed ourselves in the very thickness of the planet. This thickness of earth has given us the opportunity to create our realities free from overpowering nature and breaking away from the fears associated with the depth of the underground. Thus, we would like to conclude by saying that settling underground can be exciting after all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. If I may begin the conversation. First of all, I have the firm belief that really the most significant works of architecture really begin with the speculative. And so therefore, I have great respect for what you're doing with what you describe as speculative, but which I think, you know, because of the thoroughness of what you've done, can really lead to totally new kinds of architecture yet to be imagined. So that's great. it would have been interesting. It's because ultimately it's about, you know, the human being, the human body, the human mind. And it would have been interesting as a kind of a parallel diagram or drawing, okay, in where you have these incredible sections of habitations of different types and kinds go down into the ground, okay, but beginning at ground level. If there was a parallel, maybe not the very best sort of but contrast, but I'll throw it out there anyway, to a human being, a diver, okay, that is swimming, you know, on the surface of the ocean, okay, and then how this human being, how his or her mind, mental processes, physical processes, etc., are changed as they go down deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the ground, along with what other elements, what other tools, other, you know, air tanks, whatever, other supportive elements were needed in order to ensure that that person diving deeper and deeper into the water is, of course, not only drowned, but is, of course, not crushed, et cetera, through the pressure of the sea and so on and so forth. So I think that could have been an interesting drawing, okay? How the human being and body and mind, everything, you know, is transformed once it goes into an environment to which it was perhaps, I'm not an anthropologist, I don't know, it was not built, if you will, by nature to really exist in. So I wish that there was this kind of sort of interesting kind of parallel section, if you will, okay, but with the human being as central. And I think that could have made even richer and more, let's call it desirable, if I may use that word, okay, your very, very interesting investigation. So I'll leave it at that for the moment.
I appreciate this project very much. I appreciate all the really evocative drawings. These sections are really incredible to think about. And this word speculative, I wanted to pick up on for a second. I think it's funny, kind of this project and a little bit of the last project, but more so this one. It's a really, really thoughtful and incredibly rich setup. And at the end of your project, I was still waiting for the punchline. In other words, and what maybe this is building a little bit on what Professor David was just saying. What is the life that is produced by this system? In other words, you know, I'm thinking as you're talking, I'm thinking about terraforming, of course, and I'm thinking about other just massive kind of changes in the past humans have made to the landscape, to our, you know, in particular, the American landscape. I was thinking about the highway system, you know, the emergence of freeways and using technology vis-a-vis reinforced concrete, et cetera, to sort of terraform, you know, to transform the surface of the earth. And of course, you're now going below the surface. But what that moment in our history produced was an incredibly different way of life. It produced a new human. Because of what it allowed us to achieve in terms of mobility and the open road and all of these things and what it did for commerce. You know, we can talk all day about that, but what is the new human? What is the new human or the new humanity that is being produced by this radical inversion, or in your words, reversion of the landscape? But of course, it's not about the human. It's about the introduction to this project was a little bit more about the post-human and this triad of human, technology, and nature. Well, let's go there. I mean, let's think about, I was thinking right away when you started going underground in the very first slide, I was thinking about 12 Monkeys, the movie, and I was thinking about The Matrix, the first one. And what if you were to draw a section through those movies? You know, I'd be curious to see what the section through 12 Monkeys is. I think this is probably very close to the Matrix section, probably. But in both of those, 12 Monkeys in particular, in that case, of course, both movies are quite dystopian. And I imagine you're producing some pitch or piece of propaganda for a utopia, right? And so part of your job, I would imagine, as a kind of a team that is trying to develop a message that would promote this new world, you'd want to really communicate a kind of utopian vision of what this new life would be. But in 12 Monkeys, the animals took over the surface of the earth. And so there was a real kind of return to nature at the surface. In the Matrix, of course, there was this radical symbiosis between humans and technology, right? And so what is the relationship in your case, in your project, of this triad, this human, technology, and nature triad, and how are lines between those three things blurred or reinforced, perhaps? But also, I'd love a little bit more ambiguity between the black and the white. Like what is the kind of, maybe is there, because all of this earth that is being removed has to go somewhere. And so are there these mounds above ground? And you have some of that. And I like the slide that you're zooming in on, this blurring between architecture, earth mounds. We see some of the older buildings being co-opted and interpenetrated. And there's this sort of much messier kind of beginnings of a much messier kind of system of relationships between these things. And could we push that even further? I was also, of course, thinking about termite mounds, these incredible structures that are actually not lived in by the termites. They're used as air cooling devices and humidity machines, right? So, and that's what you're doing with your project as well. So there's this incredible kind of recapturing of nature and other species and other kind of technologies that are non-human, that are being used in the production of this architecture. So I appreciate that very much. So I'll sort of leave it at that. There isn't much of a question as much as it's a series of connections that this project is allowing me to make in my mind, and I find it to be incredibly rich, really provocative. And this word speculative, I wish then it speculated upon the kind of life that this environment then produces in terms of a new human, a new nature, a new technology, or the kind of collapse of those three things into something else or something new.
If I can add on to that, I thought, yeah, I mean, definitely I was thinking of the same movies. The other one that I thought of was I'm a Legend, where of course nature takes over and it's kind of abandoned. And but one of the things that came to mind initially when I was looking at it was the idea of the anthill, right? That there is a whole surface that is outside, and of course then you go in. But my question would be, how are you, I mean, I like the first comment of saying, how are humans going to change? Because we all know that if there is no light and lack of vitamin D, your skin is going to go pale and you're going to lose pigment. And obviously vitamin D changes your cartilage and bones. So are we going to have a different kind of, human, and how that is going to change? So my instinct initially was, wow, I kind of really like the idea of occupying the buildings above, and do those become the technological mechanisms to bring light down? Because I mean, or are you thinking completely of not having light? Is this going to transform completely I know it's speculative, but let's play the game, as we say, and say, are you bringing light? Are you, because obviously when we look at the sections, which by the way, I love them, they're fantastic. I love the whole context and the detail. I was zooming in into Miro, and it's like, you want to go even more inside. So really great work. But I was thinking, okay, how about this mound? How can you really connect the above and the below, right? Not because right now it just feels like that's why it reminded me of an anthill, just because, the ants are pulling out all the earth to create the whole space under. So I was thinking, wait a second, but why don't we create, this becomes a connection between above and below, with the city above. How can you start to use that for below? Okay, let's say you can't, inhabit anymore, but that could become the technological jump where these becomes mechanisms to bring light under, or these could be refractors, or these could be something that could be, completely out there, but I would like to see much more that it's not just under, but there is a relationship between above and below. Because I think that, unless you're thinking of humans which are completely pale and their bones are completely kind of deformed because of cartilage, then, then I would like to see, okay, how are the living spaces going to change with these kind of different kind of humans? But, what Frank touched on this idea of what's happening above, I thought was really interesting. And while we're having this discussion, I'm thinking, oh, okay, what could really happen and how this could interrelate, that this is not, that you're blurring the line between above and below. You're not just going under, but you're mixing the two. But great work. Thank you for that.
To respond.
I really love that that kind of brainstorming that you just got from Mateo in terms of how the buildings above could start to act as kind of intrinsically part of your project. Wow, first of all, what an amazing amount of work you guys have done. I'm of course going to ask for more because that's what we always do in terms of this opens up so much incredible territory. I would love to see this sort of paired with research that you guys don't necessarily do. There's a ton of people working on kind of similar issues like post-nature and sort of the future of the world for kind of a multi-species scenario and this relationship between technology, nature, and human occupation. I would love to understand your project and the development of your project in closer relationship to some of that research, specifically the sort of how this acts as an infrastructural ground. I think that your section of the New York City ground plan as you kind of pan down, I think is such a kind of beautiful, a beautiful kind of way of opening up this territory that already you're operating on a clearly constructed ground and a clearly infrastructural ground. And so your project is sort of plugging into what has already been established over the years of development of this ground. And so in terms of the infrastructure of light, of ventilation, of, heating and cooling and humidity mitigation, of structure, all of these conditions that would need to sustain your project in terms of keeping it safe for occupation, allowing plants to grow, allowing for humans and non-humans to kind of flourish in this environment. How that gets supported by all of these different infrastructural systems and the way that you might, reinvent these technologies based on, scientists who are working and speculating on these kind of post-nature conditions, I think is such an exciting place for this project to go in. And you're definitely there, but you just haven't probably had enough time to like fully flesh out that position. So this is more of a kind of provocation right now. And I think paired more closely with some of that research, I think that you guys, it would give you some things to kind of rub up against, right? Like, okay, this is some of the specific constraints that are getting developed within the kind of post-nature science research. So let me kind of put that as a constraint on this project and something that I have to respond to. Because otherwise, I think like you could do anything, right? These could be any forms, they can be any thickness, they can go any amount of depth, they can go any amount of, horizontal spread. And I think that this project could really use like some more constraints so that it also could be about the kind of construction process. Like this is clearly a multi-phased process. And so how does that work? What are the machines being used? Do they carve out any kind of all of these different forms and thicknesses, or can they only do like certain geometries in terms of the way that, they scoop the dirt and then where the dirt goes, how it gets kind of out of that? Like all of those kind of specifics, I think could offer you a sort of framework within which to work that would actually help the development of the project and would help the project also be more in tune with emerging research in this area. So I think what you've done is great, and it's a sort of beautiful provocation. It's a tremendous amount of work. And it's a very exciting thing to speculate on right now. Yeah, I would just encourage you to develop that in
project, yes, at a certain time, usually at night, yes.
in multiple, yeah, okay. But develop it in closer research to that, or in closer coordination with that emerging research, I think will just help you develop it further.
Yeah, I want to echo what Molly is saying here too, because, you know, on one hand, the project is a kind of science fiction speculation project. And we have, I always say that science fiction ends up in sort of one of two ways, either apocalypse or paradise, right? And sometimes it's apocalypse on its way to paradise. And this is toward paradise, right? You know, and but I think that there is a reality principle that could act as constraints, as Molly is suggesting, that could actually be really fruitful for the project. And one is the ground itself that you're burrowing under to kind of make a new site is not undifferentiated. You know, there's parts of, you know, solid bedrock, there's parts of silt, you know, under the Hudson, there's, you know, there's floppy parts, there's firm parts, there's, you know, and underground is not a uniform black, right? You know, it's not just down there. And its diversity, the underground's probably real diversity, would probably create also very intense differentiation between each of the strata of the parts of this of this intervention, and that could be, you know, itself give you more biomes than you think, because currently it's sort of one continuous biome that's pretty much all the same, and it looks a little bit like right now, I love it. I love the idea that, you know, don't get me wrong, but right now it looks a little bit like the genre of creating real estate where there is no real estate, right? You know, you're all out of real estate. You could tell a different backstory. You're all out of real estate in New York. You can't build any higher. So, you know, you can't densify anymore. So, you know, it's like, this becomes, you know, kind of prime real estate, right? You know, and I know that that's not what's intended, but because it's so continuously sylvan and green, and, you know, and the farm, and the, you know, it has a romantic character to it that starts to lend it to it. I think that if you pay attention to like how hot it will get, how the possibility of something like, you know, disastrous or fracking can cause. If you pay attention to maybe some of those things, those will also cause constraints as to the continuous homogeneity of this thing. Where I think it's really fascinating, and as an architectural provocation, so as a science fiction provocation, it's already fascinating. The post-nature thing, you got it. Right? But where I think it's really interesting as an architectural provocation is where you show the ants, and the ants that are contorting and they don't seem to care. It's kind of like people on the space station. They have to get used to the idea of kind of not playing gravity the same way. And so it doesn't just suggest a kind of evolutionary trajectory for animals and humanoids, you know, in this post-nature, that is one where, you know, they're existing in this subterranean, but also that the subterranean will necessarily distort us in terms of our relationship to an architecture of uprightness and view at the point of a window, where that window is at our eye level and our head is here, and, you know, and our feet are there, and all of that kind of stuff. And to me, that's the exciting prospect architecturally. And so while I love the kind of interior of the ship and the sort of floor plates, and then, I love the section. I mean, the section's beautiful. Well, I love that section. On the other hand, I'm like, wow, there's got to be about 59 million other ways to live. And I really, really love this end place where it just turns into like a kind of underground pool, because I think, wow, that's it, right? That's the provocation of this ultimate underground, and giving ourselves over to something that is not just run by human consciousness.
Yeah, question if I may. Yeah, that's great. Question if I may. Who do you imagine 100 years from now, whatever the time period is, somehow owning or dominating the surface? What are your assumptions? Who will dominate on the current surface of the earth?
The idea,
plants, animals, to the students, plants, animals, humans, monkeys, I don't know.
So our idea was that we want to create this underground structure and this facility so humans could sort of live there, and we let the plants and the greenery that we have taken away from the nature to dominate the planet. This facility is what we will be using up until the point where the nature is able to make a comeback, or is able to flourish, or able to regain what is lost. Like, that is what reversion is about, the reversion of the nature back into its own, or its natural state, or the state that is essential. And that would be dominating, would be the natural elements that humans have dominated over the past hundreds of years. So that giving them a break and letting them get back and letting them flourish is the main idea.
But thank you. So do you think it's impossible for humans and nature and the animals that inhabited nature to coexist? In other words, as you know, what is happening now, I was on a very interesting graduate jury yesterday where the students were imagining, amongst other things, maybe invasion is not the right word, but, where animals, it's not just the squirrels and the pigeons, other kinds of animals are coming into our cities, and so on and so forth. And I personally think it's kind of cool, it's a great idea. But so therefore we kicked the animals out. Okay. Now the animals are saying, sorry, okay, we're coming back, but they are really adjusting and thriving within partially an environment that we have imposed on their original habitat. The classic, the hawks and eagles that are living in the crevices of skyscrapers in Wall Street, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The coyotes, in Central Park, and so on and so forth. The raccoons in my backyard here in Brooklyn, that are migrating and so on. So that becomes a very interesting, almost kind of sort of, can there be, in your speculation, which again, I really think is incredible. By the way, the sections also remind me of Piranesi. I hope you know who that is, okay? Really incredible drawings. So my question to you, or the question that you're posing is, can there be a symbiotic relationship, okay, between 2 or 3 very different forms of life, the animals, plant life, and human life, okay, within a constantly evolving, because no one has spoken about climate change yet, within a constantly evolving planet, because there's this other player, it's the planet itself. And one of my colleagues mentioned, as you go down deeper into the earth, it's hotter, it's colder, it's this, it's that, it's not that clear cut. Right. So that becomes the 4th player, so which I think needs to also be taken into account.
Maybe Lara, Giza, you can jump in there, because I think that you do have answers to that.
Yes. So our approach towards this habitat is not only for humans, but it is a multi-species habitat. The ants, the plants, the humans, they all coexist. There's also facilities for the other animals to sort of blend in. Like you said, all the animals, when given the space away from the humans, start to come back, and they're not afraid. So similarly, this facility would be that place that they can be able to engage with. And then the addition of the farms is adding another element that the animals and the humans can interact with, so thus creating a symbiotic cycle that is more sustainable than what presently we may have.
Great.
So that was one of the focuses as well, like focusing
Great.
on multi-species.
That's a great answer. Thank you.
So
it's interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
Please go ahead, Alex.
I was just going to comment. This project really taps into my own fascinations. My graduate thesis was also on the underground, and what attracted me to the underground was something that you touched on in your development of its sort of the way you situated it within history, where it's been at times a place for the abject, right? That which is excluded, that's what we don't want to talk about. And I really like what Frank said earlier at the opening of the discussion about new humanity rather than the new human, because in that term, he started to kind of understand like the importance of the project, not in the body of the human, but in the way that the human starts to conceptualize themselves as contingent, right? As contingent in the sense that, we need to sort of bring things that we have objected or put outside of the boundaries of who we are and start to incorporate them again into the way we conceptualize ourselves. One thing that I don't want to go on and on, that's just a kind of reading of your work that I have really liked, that there's a kind of, I'd like to hear more about understanding the human and non-human as sort of sharing a subjectivity, that there's a concept of shared subjectivity that I think might be really interesting that Haraway also develops, where there's a recognition of part of a species in one another, part of humans in one another. I'd like to see some representation of how you imagine those relationships. What are the relationships that are being cultivated as interiors, right? In terms of how the human, how do the humans relate to the butterflies, for example? Are they simply spectators, or, what ways of understanding myself as contingent upon the butterfly do I now have because of your project? And also, just as a kind of another question, what do you propose might happen to all of the dirt that you dig up? That's just a kind of thing that you might want to think about as matter, as not something that's just like, there's a lot of dirt that's going to be produced out of that. And the question becomes, what can you do with it? That's just, I'm going to finish my comments there because I know a lot of people are waiting to also speak.
Mm-hmm. So to answer that, as we dig down, we're creating this hills / chimneys that are on above ground. And with the time, as we dig more, it's growing as the underground. And toward the fourth phase, it is starting to integrate with the existing building. And then we're redefining the ground plane based on that.
I think that yields so many opportunities. And I was really hoping you would say that the kind of the zero datum for ground is then reestablished, and you start to create all these new subterranean connections between the 7th floor of a skyscraper and floor 14, that you can traverse make a new connection where none previously was. And it also kind of heralds back to another question that was kind of alluded to. The other great kind of climate disaster is flooding or rising sea levels. So in a way, you're kind of fortifying this new ecosystem, this new world against the other great threat. What was interesting to me, or what struck me, is I'm kind of always a pragmatist. I always like to think of day one, where you put the spade in the ground for the first day and see what kind of questions that kind of brings up. And it kind of led me to think what your inventory of tools would be to start this great endeavor. And I think that's where I kind of would kind of question the way you've dug, that we all have kind of built our own version of this in our heads. I can see that looking around everyone's faces. But for me, it's kind of a series of tools like Gordon Matter Clark kind of cuts that are more sculptural, and objects place, or is it burrowing and earth that's being shot up into the air? And then as you go into subterranean lands, is it as homogeneous, or is it great ballrooms or football stadiums to intimate rooms? And I think that juxtaposition of size and scale is really interesting. Great plateaus, and then you kind of borrow from other interesting architects today, Ronald Rail at Berkeley, who's kind of 3D printing with earth, and see how you can kind of build in new subterranean areas. So yeah, I think that would be a question, the tooling of this enterprise. And then as you develop this city, tapping into the existing tube system, metro, subway, you call it subway, is kind of interesting. You kind of go up to the subway and reuse that. And you're creating boreholes for solar energy back to the ground plane. So yeah, I'm fascinated by the methodology and the time and the steps of creation of this world, the scale and how it can be juxtaposed against each other. And I guess like zooming in on a couple of key moments where the machinery interacts with a new piece of earth. I deeply love the kind of like fringe edges towards the bottom of the plan, where it's like the hinterlands, the marshlands, these new wilder areas that are unclaimed. And I adore the comments around the kind of paradise and chaos, which is exactly what a city is. It's the pursuit of paradise, and it's the kind of acceptance of chaos. So there will be the illegal connections created amidst this world. So yeah, I guess I just wanted to say generally well done. And my question, if there was any, was had you thought about the way you create this with tooling and what that might look like?
Yeah, and it would have been interesting to see a drawing of the intersection of the vertical along with the existing horizontal.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I really love this project. Thank you so much. And apologies, I'm the drive-by dean. I tend to turn up in people's reviews unannounced and make a few pithy remarks that are probably misinformed through only seeing fragments of presentations and then disappear again. So please humour me momentarily. I think it's a fantastic project. I'm really intrigued by the idea of actually you just going headlong into a dystopian scenario and being unapologetic about it, because in some ways, what we might want to question, what's architecture's responsibility if not to tell the truth about the environmental circumstances we are propelling ourselves towards through a wholesale destruction of the planet. And in many ways, if we make obviously life on the surface of Earth uninhabitable, which we're quite far away to doing, then we have to start entertaining the possibility of alternative places to inhabit. And not all of us are Amazon billionaires who can take off to Mars. And frankly, I'm not particularly interested in traveling there if Jeff Bezos is running the place. But I think what's interesting to me is that what you have here is, and I think a few people have touched on this, a possibility of, I think, going into a very detailed consideration of how living underground would actually diminish human beings. And maybe we need a bit of that. Maybe you could consider it a humility project. So for starters, we know that, as someone mentioned earlier, the vitamin D means our bones would get too soft, we'd have osteoporosis. And also without having artificial light would actually not do much to mitigate against the fact that we'd eventually become as blind as mole rats. And on top of that, without exposure to sunlight and vitamin D, you're in a way moving us forward into a world where what constitutes beauty is reconfigured, because our bodies would be covered in sores and we would look somewhat unattractive by contemporary metrics. And another thing that would happen actually is that we would have issues with our lung capacity because of oxygen exposure. Again, this is connected to, I know you're proposing there's an oxygen system, but I mean, I think that actually without being again exposed to natural light, there are real challenges. So I think that, you are obviously, there's a possibility, and it's alluded to, of pulling as much natural light in as possible. But I think that it's also about maybe not necessarily having to make those kind of compromises. That I wonder if in some ways we could even see this as a sort of, kind of therapy unit for bad humans who are really destructive. It's kind of a modern carceral system we could send all these oil polluting miscreants into for 6 months in order to understand just how seriously life would be altered under, if we continue to operate in the way that we're operating as human beings. But more generally, though, this notion of osteoporosis, if we are forced into these environments through our own folly, means that we would need softer environments. And the one thing I would suggest is, if you were feeling so inclined, drawings that suggested a softer kind of interior, something that could accommodate, I think more diaphanous spaces, which would allow us that cushioning against otherwise declining bone structure, how that would alter our posture, even our scale. So it would be a kind of like deconstruction of the modular man, right? It's this kind of metric around which all architecture is configured. If we then start to hunch up because our bones are so diminished, what does that mean? So I think potentially some illustration that could evidence that, and also this idea of playing out the scenario through a series of futuristic drawings, which, if you like, allow us to revisit your project 10 or 15 years from now, and 15 years of people living down there and potentially even being born down there, what would be the evolution that your space prompts, this architecture of an alternative species or an adaptive species, which I think is one of the strongest provocations, if you like, within the project. So thank you.
For sure, it does posit the evolutionary post-human condition, and and especially given the long range that it's like 24, 25 or something like that in the in the project. And but it's funny, Harriet, that you're mentioning the carceral aspect of it, because that's what I was struck by. I was struck by how much it looked like, as beautifully verdant as it is, how much it also just looked like punishment. Like, that it was that Kieran's points about labor are not just the labor of continuously having to build and mold one's environment in this subterranean world, but also that it, like, all of the images are of people like laboring. It's like the farm workers, and I would hope that 24-25 would bring to us very different ideas about laborers and laboring and what that means. And so not just a kind of post-human condition of that body and that self, but also what those selves do, and and the extent to which I don't think it would be a kind of mechanized agriculture. I don't know for sure what it would be, but there's lots of room to literally grow this idea into different forms so that it's not the mechanized agriculture that's been so associated with exploitation, perhaps.
Are there any other final comments as we get ready to come to the next project for the morning?
I would just like to quickly conclude based on the recent comments.
Please.
We were talking about how being underground and being under the depths would affect the human body, and that is correct. But our approach was that this not only being in the space would not be bar humans from interacting with the land or the above ground. We're not isolated. And we were also trying to like understand and like mess with the perception about how we always refer to underground as bad and dull and dark and undesirable, but then trying to change that perception that we could make it different. And this is just the way humans live in the high rise and on the skyscrapers and still interact with the nature. But this would be different, but then still having that connectivity with the land and not complete isolation from the land is what we were focusing on. And that's why we had efforts of bringing in light through fiber optics, but also thinking about using mirrors for reflectivity and still sort of trying to maintain that connectivity with the above ground.
I just want to add one thing, which is I love to see women world building. It's science fiction and world building has been, dominated by masculinity. And I just love to see women taking this on as a project. Excellent.
I think this is last word from me to the students. I think this is what value of this is not an either or. It's a proposition. It's in my point of view, very optimistic. Okay. Or you should feel optimistic about it as a way of moving forward, of creating a whole new series of kinds of relationships that are essential to all forms of life for all people.
I think we're running out of time, and I think much of the points have been brought up, so I'm not going to repeat any, but I just want to shed one light on one part of your research that I really appreciate, which is the historical research. I know you kind of skim through it, which is almost rewriting the history of our underground spaces, right? Or spaces of inhabitation that are carved into the ground. The timeline there that you have in the middle, I think is very interesting. I was actually looking through it. And I think I would have loved to hear more about that history because as you go into the projective, I think more constraints are needed and maybe more historical understanding of the past would help you kind of construct that imagined future. But I think I will stop at this point. So congratulations again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Eva and Gonzalo, anything you would like to say before we move on?
Just thank the guests. This has been really a fantastic conversation. And also, you know, we have to say we're very proud of Laranjisa too for kind of taking on this very difficult kind of topic. And you're all bringing really key issues that we discussed, grappled with, and there's still future to kind of really now question, right? What is the new humanity or enmeshed multi-species humanity that emerges from this? So I love the comments and really appreciate the engagement.
Yeah, I mean, I second that. Amazing, and we feel so honored to have so many amazing different perspectives on what they have been working, and really proud again for the work they were able to pull in this year. I mean, if they were able to come up with this amazing mass and volume of work under these past year circumstances, we are so thrilled to really see who they become as professional architects. So great job. Thank you, everybody.
And yes, for women world building. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Okay, I think it's a
Thank you.
I think it's a good segue. We have another strong woman world building project coming up now.
Right.
Deb, you want to launch?
Yeah, no, and in fact, I was thinking, thank you, whoever curated the sequence, this, and somehow Harriet made the segue because it's also all about soft and squishy, right? So
yeah.
Kind of, it should be a fun global conversation, I hope, by the end. But our section looked with Paul and Lawrence and myself as the guides, looked at the topic of psychosocial densities, which of course was trying to expand this notion of physical density in terms of all its social, economic, emotional, environmental dimensions, and differences with density. So crowding and sparseness, closeness and distance. This particular project you're going to see has to do with intimacy. There were some that were much more kind of larger scaled, socially, economically focused, because it started with the prompt that COVID has brought into question urban density, which has previously thought to be kind of the best model for diversity, community, physical sustainability, equities. And so there's been this severe questioning of it as a model over this past year, just the way that all extreme conditions, shine lights on patterns of culture we usually take for granted. So the students were allowed to question density itself, and also prompted to imagine what density could look like in terms of settlements and ways of life. I don't know, Lawrence, do you want to talk about the particular themes we looked at too?
Yeah, I mean, there was a kind of range that we tried to develop to kind of create a genealogy that we kind of introduced, and the students hopefully began to kind of, create their own world from those. So, we looked at ideas that considered historical topics such as urban plagues and utopian enclaves, the suburbs and other forms of ex-urban development. And then, of course, global examples in co-housing and shared resources. And finally, the science of human environmental health. So I think that in all of them, the big question was, how do you balance collective opportunities that spatial proximity offers, such as knowledge sharing, co-production, and social capital with a need for intimacy, personal space, and sequestration, either that the crisis has kind of acted as a prompt for, but also moving forward. And so the students developed different kinds of projects that dealt with, things from settlement patterns to communities of work and living, to other kind of forms that they could imagine. I think that's plenty to start with. Ida will give you a good deep dive into this.
I mean, I couldn't have asked for a better setup of we're already talking about the abject and Donna Haraway and fiction, and I'm very excited about all of these conversations because my project is called Soft Order. And I want to also thank you for taking the time to be here today. My name is Ida Marie, and I'm excited to tell you about the Squishscape residence, which aims to combat the negative impact of touch deficit. So it started from this early part of the pandemic, when it really hit its bump of, wow, we really haven't seen other people in a while, and this is getting tough. And there's a concept called touch deficit, where there's negative psychological impacts of not getting hugged and squeezed and caressed. And so I was really interested in this level of intimacy that was taken out of our everyday lives. But it did also predate COVID, as just in general, digitalization had moved the physical out of the sensorium of priority. So the concept prioritized the senses of like touch and tactility as a part of it, as a way to kind of combat the ocular centricity that exists, especially in design. I really like Bruno Latour's take on it, where it's this detachment. There's a lot of talk about emotion in my project. And so talking about modernism as a move out of wanting to deal with things and wanting to actually be enveloped in this uncontrollable world of sensing and emotions. So I always think about this kind of metaphor of like, we're doing everything online now, and our bodies are just these things that are shriveling up on the outside of this new world that we've made, like we've left them behind. So I was focused on the body in many, many ways. So I'd love to delve into like Piaget's sensory motor stage of cognitive development, and Winnicott has some great theories about holding environment and all this amazing psychology about what it takes to be comfortable in the world and how we develop our senses as children. But I think I'm just gonna keep it to this idea about memory and homecoming versus reaching out and curiosity as the two sides of my project, using tactility to not only evoke comfort and memory, but also using it to play and to explore, because I think that's a lost opportunity in a lot of design currently. So I want to enrich the home with notions of softness, tactility, and caretaking. A wall thickens like fat and muscle, a door that gives a hug, disrupting architectural canon in kind of a playful and sometimes grotesque way. So I have been taking a lot of very recognizable forms, like starting with the orders and then later the townhouse, the row house that we all, especially in Brooklyn, are so familiar with. But a central opportunity kind of emerged in this contentious war between neotenic design and the abject, because making things soft and round both nodded to some work that I've done in previous studios with children's design and neoteny and this juvenilization of design, which puts us in a caretaking position as we engage with design, but also the abject, and specifically feminist theory about abjection and body horror is where I focus, less so than the dictionary definition. I'm very interested in Julia Kristeva's work and how we fear what is the feminine sublime. So working with wombs and hugs and affection led to this exploration in aesthetic as well. Because I'm really interested in abject art and how it thematically threatens our sense of cleanliness and propriety relating to the body. And these are subjects that are just deeply intertwined in shame and degradation of the human body, particularly the feminine. And the biological success of the womb, which has been used as a precedent for architects before. Of course, it starts with Kiesler and it starts with Loos and it starts with the pseudolune and all these things, but they're missing this thing where the womb is all about the amniotic fluid, the placenta, the blood, the muscle, and it deep and often draining exertion on behalf of the incubator and the caretaker. So I feel like it has just been used as an aesthetic shell. I also briefly just want to point out that there, with neuroscience and architecture, is a very common danger of going into optimization. And I know that there's actually another studio in this year about optimizing workplaces emotionally. So I want to point out that neuroscience here is about well-being. It's not about getting the emotions out so that we can be better workers. I genuinely think that the home could offer so much more. And I definitely spent my time in this pandemic staring at my walls and going, is this the best we can do? Like, we're not gonna offer anything to my emotionally drained self. So throughout my soft endeavors, whether I was pushing or pulling or drooping or stretching, this kind of squish is the repeated language, and I utilized it also in organizing the townhouse. It aids my desire to stretch programs through each other and create dynamic points of contact, both between architecture and human, but also between occupants, as this is a co-living house. Affectionate gestures are inserted into the rituals, which I looked at how a day was actually a bunch of sensations in a row and which ones were missing, and how there were certain times during the day where a hug would be especially needed, and how this actually aligned with doorways frequently. So that's how this all started, as a hug. But studying hugs and how to mimic the squeeze and mimicking different types of affection is something that I think there's a really important conversation about inclusivity in design, and how I owed the majority of this to work done by people working for design for the autism spectrum disorder and other sensory processing disorders, where this idea of compression and the squeeze and deep pressure stimulation has been around long before. I mean, Temple Grandine's The Squeeze, which is just a hugging machine, which is from 65. And then, of course, I found that through newer, more science fiction type work like Lucy McRae's, where I was just kind of disappointed that it's not brought up that this is something, an emotional coping mechanism that has been used, and that we can all benefit and give some credit where it's due. I found out actually that Temple specifically used it for dealing with tactual defensiveness, as she called it, which is just the aversion to touch, but also the majority of the time, the weighted blankets and vests and squeeze machines are used as like a womb, like pressuring back into calmness. So this central organ, or the heart, reaches through the home, connecting all the spaces in a continuous fluid system of distinct parts, but all blending, much like the systems inside of us. Delimitation and liminal spaces was a point of departure, and how continually questioning what membranes separate and connect, and what thickening can become, which is also a spatial play and ambiguity that I find really endearing in Aldo van Eyck's work, which I like to bring up because I'm doing a lot of soft things that don't seem very rigid, and he's one of my favorite precedents as like a very geometric, rigid way to also create these in-betweens, these fun moments of coming together. This, especially the playful door, which is both thick and occupiable, a choose your own adventure. There's not one way to go through it. And then the ways that spaces come together and squish on top of each other to create other spaces, with a common thing in architecture, you know, where they all become dependent on each other, like organs are. So the heart accommodates each space it touches, reaching into all the rooms, sometimes opening, thinning, and is this large thing where you can only see parts of it at a time. So while we have the ability to see it in section and the way I can represent it as a whole, when you're in this house and this large organ is in the middle, you really only see parts of it at a time, and you revisit different parts as you go through the home. So it's really about continuity and being able to locate yourself as a part of a system. And the primary reason to have it stretch up the way it does was really for the central bathroom. I wanted to centralize maintenance and care, and the bathroom stretching up through the building and touching every single space, to talk about privacy and shame and collective caretaking, where it comes together as this sort of gradient with ensuite washrooms, I guess we could call them, that lead into a central, almost monumentalized sink, because I think that there's so much to be unveiled in terms of shame and the bathroom and how we feel about sectioning off the home and not being connected. Because I really don't understand why a bathroom sink is this conversation with ourselves in the mirror parallel next to each other, as opposed to something where we can gather and really unveil that human upkeep and maintenance and the gross beings that we are, it takes a lot of work, and it's something we can do together. So this, let's see, challenging the standard gently, something that I think is important with talking about all these utopian dystopian dynamics that we've brought up in science fiction. It's kind of heartbreaking to say that the most futuristic, unthinkable part of this is that it relies on a defetishization of the body. This has to be cited in a world where co-living and sharing is not threatened based on the social dynamics of the patriarchy. So in a sad way, I was challenging myself in all these drawings to shed behind kind of the male gaze and how we can act in space and be seen by each other, because it's the utopian world where maybe one day we can coexist non-sexually with each other in a cohabitational space that's not just young women trying to figure out like where they're going, or college roommates who are on their way to their full unit, their full family, their final resting point, because I just don't think that model works for our times at all. So the upward reaching motion that I talked about, this kind of squish, also allows what I call like democratization of the windows, because in a townhouse, I'm sure if anyone who's lived in one in Brooklyn, the window spaces are very much like each room, which one has what, and by reaching up, we can kind of share in this way where there's no reason in the Squishscape residence to have that many windows in the entryway, when a lower room can reach up and get this light well in. And it also creates this surface, this kind of point of friction where the two spaces see each other, because we don't just have walls and floors that we think of as walls and floors, we have other organs entering our spaces. The wombs, my favorite part, this is where it all came from. This idea of the womb room and being able to crawl into something. Maybe this says more about how I was doing making this project during the pandemic, but being able to crawl into a thickened wall and be just hugged and totally sensorially taken care of in that way. I thickened walls and made in between spaces that were this privacy, which also, because privacy and the body coming up so much, I think it is important to say that when deprivatizing central spaces, it doesn't mean to take away from the value of having time to yourself and having space to yourself. It's more so questioning whether you take time to yourself for reasons of shame and not being able to share, or because it's the standard, or because you need that moment. So the wombs are infused with warmth and a heartbeat, and kind of the biomimicry of kind of taken to the extreme, where you are under this heavy weighted pulsating blanket in parts of it, or the walls can expand and breathe. I think I went, there we go. The kitchen as well, less developed obviously, because I think we've really started opening the walls to the kitchen. It's starting to be done, where the maintenance and work that happens in the kitchen is no longer a private gendered thing, but really here's where I played with the exploration and flexibility and discovery, and how we could use softness, not just for all of these theoretical notions that I've touched on, but also just to play, to make things that are different, and to question the canon as far as what is a kitchen cabinet. So the hardest part is now the inside of the body meets the world at this certain point, and we do have a shell, and we do negotiate how we share like the abject with the outside world. So I was working with this as like an interior, and really indulging myself in delving into this this internal world, but to an extent, it's also about how there's so much tension with the outside world, and whether or not we can be soft, and how much the outside world has to fit this utopian, which is not, I'm not a believer in utopias. So saying that is like this idea that the world isn't like that. The world does not currently accept softness. It does not respect vulnerability in the way that this project really wants. And so soft architecture as a general field that I came upon at the beginning of my research was just, I think, needs more attention, needs more love. There's some great work that just touches on soft architecture. And I have so many things I would love to share, and I will not, because I would love to hear from everyone else, but this is kind of what the inside of my brain has looked like in researching this. So if anybody has a particular interest in one of these topics as well, I'm always excited to talk, and I'll leave it at this Squishscape residence.
I just want to say that just blew me away, and I'd like to see your film. I'd like you to make a film.
Cinematography has been such a big part where I just did not have the skills. I've been thinking about it, so I'm so glad that you bring that up.
You think cinematically, and I appreciate that the cinematic travel you took us on is architectural, based on all these intersecting incredible responses to our environment. So please make that film.
Thank you. I'll have to find a crew. Some people that didn't go that maybe took a different major.
Ida, am I pronouncing your name correctly? Ida?
It's Ida.
Ida, thank you for the correction. I really want to thank you for this work. This is, wow. This is really something that I think it's an area that's really, let's call it swelling within architecture. That there's a book, I don't know, have you come across the work of Lisa Robertson? She's a poet. Yeah.
Yeah, I have the little soft manifesto I managed to somehow get from the gallery exhibition in '99.
I'll put some other references into the chat, just to not go through them here. What I really liked about this is there's in your focus on touch as an intelligence, you know, touch as an intelligence that kind of, imagine we don't have sight to build our understanding of the world. You know, what world does that build for us? You know, how far does it extend? How long does it last, right? Does it last as long as you're sort of pressing on it or in contact with it? Does that world evaporate or go away after that pressure is released? So your drawings are, I think, starting to kind of produce an understanding of the body. I think that what I would like to, some of the things I would like to see extended is affect. I'd like to understand what sorts of affect these moments are producing in the subjects that are encountering and interacting with them. You know, and finding, I think that your use of the zine or of the sort of comic might be a way to start to suggest that, to suggest affect. But really, it's on the level of form, and I think that the work is really, I think that you can make the next step by actually moving along bodily references to form, and perhaps understanding what, you know, thinking about thinking about an architecture that's defined by affect rather than form, right? And thinking about the interaction between built space and humans as actually that's where architecture is. It's not in one or the other, it's between. Sarah Ahmed writes beautifully about this, describing affect and interaction as either slippery or sticky. And in an accumulation of repeated interactions, that's where the materiality of affect occurs. That's where it builds up or slips away. So, well, I think that your drawing suggesting kind of explicitly bodily references are great, and they're really working. I mean, they're such powerful drawings, and I'm moved by them. I think that I worry a little bit. Well, I don't worry about anything with you. Let me be explicit about that. I think that there might be a world beyond them. You know, you're very good at them, but then what's beyond them? How can you not get stuck in them yourselves? How can they not be sticky for your intellect? I think finding ways of kind of tapping into the ways that buildings change our subjectivity, and who do we become, and understanding it not as something that we can know, but something that we have to enter into without the possibility of knowing, because we cannot yet imagine it. It's the unimaginable. And kind of coming up with a practice of architecture that cultivates rather than form circumstances through which that affect can emerge. And it's not done alone, and it's not done with existing power structures, but it's done intersubjectively, where you enter into this thing that you can't yet imagine. And I think that's the power. So I would focus on practice as a next step. Like the great thing about thesis is it's the launch of your intellectual life. And I think you've got from what I see here, you've got a long and valuable one ahead of you. So thank you for this one.
Thank you so much for all the kind words.
They're not kind.
I just wanted to kind of start by saying that was beautiful. That was really poetic. It kind of got me thinking about this catalog of gestures of intimacy and how they bridge you throughout the day or through your life. And it's interesting to think, even as this blob being kind of a manifestation of your nurture, and the more you tend to it, the more it grows, and it grows in different shapes and forms. And yeah, someone else mentioned that I don't quite think it would be as homogeneous as this. It would be texturized. It would probably have areas of callus and more areas that are tender or smoothed through its use or the ritual of that inhabitation. But that will come through you continuing down this path of research, which is really, really eloquent. It also kind of struck me as a true unifier between interior and architecture. It could morph, shift into either direction, becoming infrastructural or, shrinking to something very intimate that's kind of hand-shaped or sized. So I think the capacity for kind of growth is, incredible. I'm just excited to see where you go with it next.
Ida, I'm curious about the kind of material and tectonic reality of this project. So within the kind of set of the spectrum of references you're making in your kind of map of your people and your landscape within architecture and associated disciplines, we could look at a number of different material realities that they're proposing. Everything from projection in the case of Lavin's kissing architecture, to literal softness, to implied softness but literal hardness, and everything in between, right? So I'm curious here about how you take this project, which I think is a really elegant kind of proposal, into the next phase of thinking about like literally the nuts and bolts of the architecture. So are the surfaces that you're proposing literally soft? All of them literally soft? Are they, they have implied softness but literal hardness? Do they literally move? You were talking about they kind of breathe and things like that. I think of a project like Succulent House by Murmur, Heather Roberge's office in LA, where it's harnessing rainwater into a flexible bladder that then, kind of expands and contracts depending on the climactic condition. Things like that, where you're actually starting to tip into other systems within architecture, I think it'd be really, really interesting. I also am reminded by, I taught a studio a number of years ago in which I took the students to the headquarters of Hasbro Toys. And we had a conversation with the director of animatronics there, who's an engineer, retired car engineer, coming over to the toy industry. But as a director of animatronics, he's doing mechanized toys that are intended to respond to you emotionally. So like a toy cat or something that snuggles with you, that purrs, that interacts with you in a way that is as closely related to a real cat as possible. So it's tapping into a lot of the same things that you're talking about in terms of an emotional kind of reaction from something that isn't in fact emotional, right? And isn't in fact alive in the way that we often think of it. And it was so interesting. He was talking about how when they started designing one particular new toy, they put a ton of motors in it. And it's really easy, he said, to make something that can respond to you emotionally, like a human or like a kind of pet or whatever, if you have unlimited motors. In this case, the motor was the most expensive component. He said, but when you only have 2 motors in terms of like a budget, it's much more difficult. And you have to, as a designer, you have to be much more creative about where you're going to put that energy. And so, architecture, I think it's great that you didn't try to include all of these aspects in this project, because they could easily sort of dilute the sort of power of where the project is at right now. However, given where you've gotten to, I think it could be really useful for the next sort of phase to start to take on some of these constraints. And I think I use budget as one of those, but like if you're thinking about, okay, how am I structuring this? How am I materializing this? And then where can I put that energy, whether it's, budget or other things, to really kind of start to think about how a project like this could exist in the real world, not with an unlimited budget, not within, a kind of any site, any kind of socio-political context, et cetera, like thinking about, realizing this and adapting, sort of modifying where needed to make this somehow a realistic proposal, I think would really enhance and make it all the more powerful, because it's not simply a speculative project at that point. It's like a real proposal, right? Because you've considered all of these different conditions. And it seems to me that you're poised at that place with this project to be able to do that. So I would just sort of challenge you to maybe have that as your next phase.
I'd love to materialize this. I think I also have to thank you all for bearing with the fact that I'm proposing something non-visual in a purely visual format. So I do see the irony of a Zoom Touch Me project. So I think materializing it as real built is going to be a lot of fun.
I think it's more than the opportunity. I mean, there's a lot of great stuff going on in this project. But I have a couple concerns. One is that I'm a little bummed out that softness tends to be reserved for domestic environments and domestic interiors, as opposed to the potential for the publicness, of this. And I see in the comment, Paul is beating me to this to this point in the comment.
Sorry about that. I should keep quiet.
And I like that it seems to suggest something like a kind of encounter with the real, and the real is always a little bit revolting, right? But where I think this project for me gets pushing is when it comes into that bathroom and you're looking at that bathroom. And I'll tell you that your discussion of the mirror, all of a sudden is an incredibly kind of feminist discussion, because men complain if there's no mirror because they can't shave. They use the sink and then they shave. And so, it's that hegemony of the mirror over the sink has, roots in that. But when I say that this really, gets going and out of the kind of just linguistic dualisms of the abject, the real, the linguistic, the non, signified, is when you start talking about care and care of the body and care of self and care of, a sort of environmental care. And therefore, what's really exciting to me is that this could become the kind of ethos of the architect, that in a way, almost it stops mattering to me that it's domestic or not domestic, that it's real, that it's not abject, that it's, that it's touchable, that it's, all of those binaries that get played out. You have the kind of person in the, in the system, and then you have a person not in the system, and they're like the heart to heart, right? Heart to heart. And that care, we went from being, an architecture of historicism to an architecture of functionalism to an architecture of probably formalism. But maybe the next step is an architecture of care, an architecture of empathy, and that's motivated by those desires and starts there. And that is so exciting to me in this project, is that motivator of the forms, that motivator of the signs, that motivator of, a lot of the interactions and interstices in this project. And your conscious discussion that keeps introducing care as a primary motivator, to me is, gives me, great hope that we can re-examine everything, bathrooms, interfaces, infrastructures, all the way across the otherwise, kind of almost 19th century urban experience that's still with us today.
Yeah, I definitely have to credit that a lot of impact happened after hearing Maria Guidici talk about care and maintenance. So her work is definitely crucial to what you're speaking about for me.
Well, we don't have an adequate aesthetics of care, right? It's been so modernized and has been pushed to the side of concerns. And you're starting to suggest an aesthetics of care, which I think is even more exciting than just an ethics of care.
If I can take on to the last thing that Dora was saying, empathy. I think that why I find this project absolutely great is because it's you. And very little times have I seen projects that are, a real reflection of what you've gone through. And for me, this is extremely important when we look at work that, that even listening to you and looking at the images, it was like really you there, and really the empathy and really everything that you've gone through. And I think that quite a lot of us, around the world during this pandemic have gone through the same thing. So it was very, let's say, emotional. So I think that that's something which is extremely important when you do a project, that you're able to spark an emotion and you're able to get the person really involved. And probably one of the things that I thought, which is, it's from the 1970s, is a cartoon that I used to watch. It was called Barba Papa. I don't know if it was in America also, but
I wasn't raised in America, so I'm familiar.
Yeah, so Barba Papa is, of course, this shape-shifting blob, but which actually holds the family in it. And so when I was looking at this, I'm like, oh wow, I this is barba papa, and this kind of love of sharing and of holding, of shape-shifting around its family and protecting the family. So while I was going through this, those were the images that were coming up, which is kind of really interesting because it's from the 70s. But I wanted to kind of throw something out there, which is different to all these things that I appreciated, is that my question then would be, okay, so this is what you have in the home, right? And this is, would you even go out if you're getting so nurtured in this home and so loved and so taken care of that would you create then the opposite? I'm trying to play with the same idea of what you started the discussion on, which was, of course, the digital and this idea that we're on Zoom and that there is no physicality. But then the question would be, it's kind of provocative, is, okay, if the whole house gives you everything, even more, how are you going to react to that? And then at the same point, I find that it would be really interesting to think of it, more in a collective sense. How do you start pulling people into that? And is the house, and blurring again the boundaries of the house, where the house is not the house anymore, which is not only protecting you, but is able to get other people in there. So it's kind of like a spark for another kind of discussion, but I've really appreciated the project. Really great work.
Yeah, if I may add to what's been said, first of all, I speaking also like my colleagues as a practicing architect, this is the real challenge. This is really, you have set out for us through your eyes as an architect, okay, which is extraordinarily important, okay? Really, what we need to be aware of, what we need to know about ourselves, what we need to know about human needs, as in fact we engage with this theme of as density, but also for me, as you mentioned, it's and others have mentioned the notion of intimacy. How is that defined? It's something that you said very clearly we need. Well, how can we somehow help that along to achieve appropriate levels of intimacy? And I was particularly taken by what you said, one of the things you said, which is co-living and sharing are not threatening. That's an incredible challenge, because that directly relates to not only the physical, co-living and sharing, but also the mental, the psychological, and so on and so forth. The only thing that I would add, maybe it's there somewhere, okay, is really what are those mechanisms, that we need that would somehow trigger the rest of our emotions. Now, what we're seeing here on the screen, of course, is, it's graphic, it's visual, it's listening to you talk and so on and so forth, okay? But the notion of not just touching, but what we are touching, how the notion of touching or stepping on something makes us feel, okay? How, the temperature of the room makes us feel, how the subtlety of expression of another person who is impacted by a physical environment, how does that make us feel, and so on and so forth. In other words, as you hopefully continue this investigation, which we would all benefit from, these other sensations, are in fact explored, and somehow you lead the way in terms of an awareness of these sensations, and how we as architects can in fact begin to mind them, to, as you say, get rid of, amongst all the other things that you're mentioning, the fear or the threat of co-living and sharing and intimacy. So this is a really, really commendable piece of work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, and I'll add a few comments. I apologize, I may have just spoken over somebody.
No, it's okay.
I don't want to interrupt you. You sure? Okay. Thank you for bringing this to the agenda, really. I think I don't want to repeat what other people have acknowledged. And I did want to point to Meredith's comment in the chat, actually, which I think is, again, building upon what Dora observed regarding the externalization of care, rather than it always being a domestic interior project, as being a potential direction for this. How do we know what's going on necessarily in the interior, that this is available if there isn't potentially an exterior manifestation that would be the lure to come into this space at all. I mean, just to be, I guess, contrary, because there's so much about this project is strong, it's almost hard to find a critique, but just for the fun of it, I was thinking a bit about what, the obviously very literal representation of the womb-like environment as a caring space. And of course, if one is always designing with a very diverse end user, since you brought up diversity of cognitive function as part of your research, then for some, of course, the womb is not necessarily either practically or symbolically a safe space for all kinds of complex reasons. So I think it's interesting. I think that one of your mitigations has been to offer spaces that are very much about some sort of individualized rehabilitation versus spaces which are much more about some form of collective interaction around engaging with this environment. And of course, the individualized spaces speak to, in a way, the kind of continuing social isolation to which we're all subjected. So there's something of the kind of, it feels very much, not so much futuristic, which is sometimes refreshing relief in some projects, but very much something that could be configured within a space of a couple of months and deployed, and would probably do a lot to mitigate us against our current isolations. But I did want to suggest that somewhere in all of this, there's some opportunities, if you are not already, building this into the book, basically a PhD thesis proposal, because clearly the academic capacity of this project is enormous, and I really did, appreciate many of your illustrations and the time you took to put together your psychosocial densities drawing. I thought that was really sophisticated. But I think that, there is something about the interfaces between the existing infrastructure of the standard Brooklyn brownstone, as you pointed to at the beginning, and of course all of these kind of incursions with the slightly Gordon Matter Clark carving out of interiors to create these softer spaces. And I think there's a lot to be said about how those things attach to each other, what that relationship could be on a detailing level, and what kind of performativity could be embedded into those, if you like, interfaces that could give this almost a mechanical or kinesthetic propensity, and also do things to address this like heating and cooling, and potentially, water flow and so on. So I think that overall astonishing thesis, and again, has the potential to be the beginning of a PhD proposal, never mind an undergraduate project. So congratulations, and I look forward to seeing what you do with it next.
Thank you so much.
I just want to add two things, and these are more like more challenges actually. Having read Winnicott's text as a mom, so having read it both as a like in theory classes, and also then as a mom. So the plush toy stage, it's a stage in child development. Eventually, Winnicott says the toy will be replaced by culture. Still in the sense of play and pleasure, like it won't, those won't disappear, but that's how it is cultivated. And in a way, like, I mean, there are theories, overarching theories where, tactility eventually slowly gets abstracted to something else. In Riegel's theory, this is, you start tactile, you turn into optical. So it doesn't have to be like, these overarching theories can be challenged, of course, but there's a whole kind of background to what you're saying. And there's a lineage of works that are actually related to that background that are not in your map of sources and references. So those are things that I would like to point toward. And in terms of going back to Winnicott, maybe that's also about how this domestic unit turns into a larger social structure, or if it does, like what does it imply for a larger social structure, I think is important in a Winnicott sense too. Like if plush is one stage, what's the next stage? So Winnicott actually proposes that we can reimagine culture completely if we start with the plush toy. So what would that be? Like how does this turn into greater social structures? I think a really good open question that you can take this work to the next level And a couple of things that I think could be included in your list of references is Sylvia Lavin's Kissing Architecture, that whole question.
It's referenced in there, but
I did not see it in the mailbox. So
but I agree, it was a She took the words out of my mouth as I was writing my own project.
Nikki de Saint Paul, I think, would be a great reference. Also, like, I forgot the name of the Los Angeles artist, performance artist, How Many Hours of Love? Like this artist that collected all the plush toys that were thrown in the trash. I'll find it and write it in chat.
That'd be great.
And there's a very curious resource, I think, that's definitely worth thinking about, especially since you responded, yes, I'm thinking of materializing, you know, what would its realization look like, is Paul Rudolph's work with Ultra Suede, the material. And George Wagner's writing on this, actually, are interesting references.
I appreciate it. And definitely, if send any in chat, I'll be super excited
to read them.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, this continuous theme that's coming up of like, it's the house. I do think there's, that shows like the blind spot of me doing this during the pandemic and being unable to open up to the fact that there was anything outside of like the four walls I could see. So I think taking the same approach, and now that things start to improve, seeing like going out into the world and thinking like, okay, I've fostered all this in my little nest, but it's not just mine, it's broader. So I think that definitely is why it's the residential model it is every single time it was suggested, I look at another space, I was like, I can't think of anything but the house. I'm stuck in it. So I'm sure that's going to be a sign of the times. Looking back at this, it's going to be.
Well, I can imagine your work, and I hope you'll continue it, as has been suggested, is really, and to bring it to the moment, in the hopefully post-pandemic world, whatever that means, to really reconnect us, okay, but in very different ways, okay, than the way we were connected in the past. So it has this optimistic potential, if you will, for better connections between us and between our and the environments within which we are meant to exist and coexist. So I think I just want to add that as you know, something that I hope will encourage you, you know, to continue on through your work, you know, and your eyes as an architect, and but not just as an architect, you know, as a person that really has a very passionate but also perceptive view of things. Okay, to find us, to help us build new ways of reconnecting with those things that matter most, and where your work also acts as kind of a filter, because maybe some things, you know, we shouldn't reconnect with. You know what I'm saying? So it's not about, you know, it's, so therefore it is very much about the future, and I encourage you to continue it, to help us. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I had the question that you just answered a minute ago, which is exactly that, the domestic scale. And I was wondering, really, without diminishing the conversation here, if this is an adaptive reuse kind of project, where you take on the townhouse, right, in Brooklyn, that you relate to so much, and kind of you recast it and you rethink it. And if it is the case, you know, what happened to the party walls, for instance, right, and the relationship to the neighbor, and if those ideas could start to kind of inflict at the scale of the block, right, at the scale of the urban, as opposed to, or how do you bring the intimate scale into the urban, for instance? You might have an answer already.
No, I barely grazed it, but I think you're speaking to many things that moving beyond this. I use the row house more as a theoretical. I didn't want to cite it because I had so much internal theory to deal with that I needed to take it one step at a time before also dealing with the social outside the walls. So it was more of a model that could be placed anywhere because it's a familiar type. And yeah, I did not develop as much neighborly love as I think it could offer. But I had some fun in some of my representations, like the deeper you dive into the world, it's this cutout in the kitchen shelf actually doesn't make sense architecturally and means that they share wine glasses with the neighbor. But it's not like a developed architecture as much as it's playing with those notions of sharing.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I'm mentioning is because exactly I see the potentials there, that if you would question the party wall, it's not only about questioning the neighbor relation to private space of the family, for instance, but also the idea of public or private property, let's say, even more so, right, in Brooklyn. So the townhouse is it's a real estate lot, right? It's defined as private, you cannot access it. And in a way, your project has the potential to also challenge those zoning principles, right, on the urban scale, exactly by bringing the intimate and the domestic into the public.
Do we have any more comments from any of the critics before we conclude this morning's session?
My final comment for this project is I so deeply appreciate the honesty of it. It's something that is indelible for me. I'll carry it forward. As one thinks about, I told my students, I said, you know what, you need to mark down what your feelings were during the pandemic, all of it, because frankly, your children and grandchildren are going to want to know about it. What was it like every day? How did it affect you? How did it change your view of where you were in the world and how you fit into the world and all of it? And for me, this project brings to the forward the importance of taking stock of the moment we just lived through.
Yeah, it helped me to, I read a piece about how Friedrich Kiesler was starving when he was critiquing that modernism wasn't meaty enough, and how deeply transparent that kind of is, that the architect cannot separate how they're doing from their work. And I ran with that in terms of really just putting myself and that into it. So I'm glad it came across that way. And thank you for everyone's amazing feedback. And I'm excited for all these directions. I'm frantically copying links so I can continue this, as you said.
Deborah, you want to say anything before we go? Oh, you're muted. I feel like we're back in class.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure for all of us, I think Lawrence, Paul, and myself, to follow Ida's brave trajectory. And I've enjoyed being the wall she's bounced. I think we've all enjoyed being the wall she's bounced off of, if not punched through, over the year. So.
Yeah, me too, Ida. It's been an interesting journey.
Thank you for putting up with it.
Soul searching, and you really kind of found your pacing. It's fantastic.
I appreciate
For me, especially working on the writing and the research, as I'm sure all of you can tell, there was so much more research and also lots of writing that there was nowhere near enough time for Ida to show today. But her booklet, for those of you who are interested, is in the works, will be submitted soon, and I know she's planning all kinds of tactile material versions of it in different physical forms.
Critics, thank you so much for your time today on a Saturday and your great comments all across the day. And those of you that are staying this afternoon, we're looking forward to seeing you. But as always, we at Pratt, we appreciate your generosity.
Yes, thanks. It was a great morning.
Great work.
Wonderful dialogue. Thank you. Wonderful dialogue.
Really fantastic.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Wait, do we go on a different link now, Lawrence?
I think in the afternoon.
There's an hour break. There's an hour break, and then there's new links in the spreadsheet. And I think I'm not hosting. Different people are hosting.
I'm leaving.
Oh, you're not hosting? You lucky boy. You're lucky.
Thank God. Yeah, and that's
I'm
just
leaving.
Hard.
I can't leave this
Yeah.
thing.
Okay, he's back there laughing.
Everyone here. Take care. Until later.
Okay.
Okay, we'll see everyone later.
Yeah, sorry.
Hey, Ida, good job. She's gone. All right.
She's gone. Yeah, sorry I had to take that call. I was just afraid it was my mom,
Yeah, no problem. Everything okay? She's all right?
No, we found her.
Okay, that's good.
It was nuts.
Crazy. Okay, I'll see you in an hour.